Hey, welcome back to the channel. And on this video, we're going to get into the carburetors, the rebuild, the cleaning for the ZX7. So stay tuned. So these are the carbs, and I think in an earlier video, well, I know in an earlier video, I did a very basic cleaning of these carburetors just to get them to perform in a way that would just allow the bike to run. So what I need to do now is I need to completely de-rack these and properly clean, lube, and reassemble with new O-rings in the various places for the fuel and the venting and all of that kind of thing. New float bowl gaskets and all that sort of good stuff. So the first thing that I've done here is I've soaked all of the bolts, the screws, with penetrating oil. PB Blaster is what I've used first, and I'll let that sit for a while. And galvanic corrosion, which is typically what you get when these screws are steel screws into aluminum threads, it becomes a huge pain in the backside to get them out. And it's very easy, even using JIS screwdrivers, which I always use. It's easy to gall these screws up and make a mess of them. So the JIS screwdrivers are just a little bit shorter. They're not quite as pointed as a Phillips. So with the JIS, which is a Japanese industrial standard screw, if you use a conventional Phillips screwdriver, let's say something like that one, which is, I'm not going to do that here, but they don't fit quite as tight and they don't sit deep enough. And so what that means is if you start to use that, it'll just kind of rise up, and as you turn it, it'll tend to push the screwdriver up and out, and it'll kind of cam out on you, and that starts to chew up the heads. Now, I'm not saying that's never going to happen with a JIS screwdriver, because it could absolutely happen. It's happened to me many times, because these things get seized in there so badly. You've got to apply so much pressure to get them out. Sometimes it's inevitable, but what I will say is your chances of buggering them up becomes much less if you use the right tool in the first place. So that's the first thing. The second thing is when I clean carburetors, I use three techniques all the time. So there's chemical, mechanical, and ultrasonic. Those are the three things that I always do. A lot of folks think that ultrasonic cleaning is the be-all and the end-all, but it isn't. It's very good. It will get a lot of the dirt out. It certainly does a really nice job on the carburetor bodies and the external parts. Makes them kind of all nice and clean and shiny again, and it will unclog certain passages and that kind of thing. But what it doesn't always do is unclog the passages and the various jets and these kinds of things. If you can imagine the passageways and the circuitry in the carburetor where the fuel and the air passes through, I mean, it's kind of up and down and all over the place. It kind of roots here, there, and everywhere. And because you're dropping these in an ultrasonic tank full of water, and whatever chemical you're choosing to use in the ultrasonic cleaner, inevitably you are going to get air trapped in there, and it doesn't always make its way out. And therefore, there's things that can get stuck. There's blockages that may not get unstuck with the use of the ultrasonic cleaner. So what I find is I always use a carb cleaner, and I always shoot it through the various passageways and learn where it's supposed to come out, so you can see the chemical going in one place and coming out another. And then I always use the carburetor tools to chase some of those passageways, or a high E guitar string works well, thin enough to pass through. That's the mechanical side of things. So I try to make sure that I do all three of those things in every circumstance, and allow the right amount of time for all of that sort of stuff. So if I'm going to end up soaking parts of these carbs in a chemical cleaner, then I'll leave it for a minimum of 6 hours, usually overnight, to get things really clean before I even think about dumping it in the ultrasonic cleaner. The other thing that I try to do, and I say try to do because I've been guilty of missing this step a number of times, is try to make sure that these things are relatively clean externally before I start to disassemble them, and before I put them, you know, throwing, whether it's chemicals or ultrasonic cleaning or whatever else, because the more crap that's on the outside of these carburetors, the more chance, in my mind, of some of that crap getting into places that it shouldn't be. So the cleaner I can get the outer bodies of these things before I start disassembly, the better. And so that's just kind of another step that I take along the way. So anyway, enough rambling on. Okay, so the usual setup for those of you who have not seen me do this before. What I like to do is I have to have one set of bins for each of the 4 carburetors, and then a couple of bins for any of the common components. When I say common components, I'm talking about stuff like these racking bars and that kind of thing. And then I'll either, you know, put the top end components in one bin and then the float ball pieces in another, and that way it keeps everything separate and distinct. Some carburetors, as you may know, are identical. There's no differences between the jetting or the screws or anything that's in each one on some carbs. In other carbs, they are different. So you'll have some carbs that might have an accelerator pump, some that don't. Some of the float bowls are maybe slightly different from one carb to another, even if they're in their same rack. On some carburetors that are on the same rack, even some of the lengths of some of the screws may be different because of the shape of the upper body of the carburetor. And if you start sticking the wrong screws in the wrong float bowls, you'll start to impact on certain parts of the carburetor body. That's not the case on these ones, but it is the case, for instance, on some of the V4 Honda carburetors. So it's just easier and simpler to keep everything separate. And if it came off carburetor number 1, then, you know, put it back on carburetor number 1. So that's kind of the general reason I do that, keep everything straight. And then the other thing I like to try to do is just to, you know, it's easy to get things reversed, right? So this is the way that the carbs go on the bike. This is carburetor number 1. But if you're in the disassembly process and you flip it over like this, you know, don't forget that this is now carburetor number 4. Seems easy enough to remember that, but countless are the times where I've buggered that up and kind of got things backwards, and yeah, just keep that in mind. So to avoid buggering up the head, I'm going to use my vice grips. Now you can use an impact driver on these, the one, the kind you smack with a hammer, if you're careful. The downside of that is, you know, you can, you know, snap off certain things if you're not careful. First. There we go. Just a really, really long, thin bolt. Put the nut back on the end for safekeeping. Okay, so I think what I'll do now is I'm just going to start to separate these carburetors, but I'm going to do it the other way around so I don't get myself all confused with which way around these things go. The other thing I got to be careful of here is when I go to start to separate these things, the sink springs are easy to lose if you're not careful about how you take these things apart. So most of the time they'll stay in, but occasionally you can have a problem with that. So just, you got to be careful. Okay, so all I've done here is I've just taken out the breather tubes and the fuel crossover tubes and the springs that go between the throttle linkages on the carbs, and I've taken the idle adjusting cable out of carburetor number 2. So now basically what I'm left with is 4 separate carburetors, and what I'm going to do next is I'm going to take the top caps off all of them, put them in the top bins up here. And then I'll take, once that's done, I'll take the float bowls off and put all the contents in these blue bins at the front. And again, use the JIS screwdriver. Plenty of downward pressure. I know these ones have not really been over tightened because I'm the one that put them on. So I know that they should come off reasonably easy, because as I said before, I did have these carburetors apart just to give them basic cleaning before I fired that bike up a while ago. So I should be able to satisfy myself that none of them have been over torqued. I think that's part of the problem, to be honest, with carburetors on the old bikes, is that oftentimes when people clean these carburetors over the years, they don't replace all of the gaskets and the seals, especially on the float bowl, right? They don't replace any of that stuff. And over time, those seals, those rubber rings, whatever you want to call them, the gaskets, they get compressed. And when they get compressed, they start to lose their ability to seal, and then they start to leak. So to compensate for that, people generally just start cranking down as hard as they can on these things to try to get them so that they don't leak anymore, when what they should have been doing is just putting in, new carb gaskets and whatnot, and saving themselves all kinds of grief, and grief for the people like me who come after. Okay, so here's just a reminder, and this is as much for me as it is for anybody watching. When you take these things apart, inevitably there are things that fall off as you're disassembling. So one example would be, once you've removed the this slide choke mechanism right here, this thing that I took off earlier, I had forgotten to remove these little washers that sit on the carburetor body that allow that mechanism to slide back and forth. And again, just at each stage, it's a good idea just to kind of look at the carburetor, turn it around, check to see if there's anything that's going to fall off. So another obvious thing that is going to fall off is these sink springs. So if it's going to fall off, take it out, put it somewhere safe, because it'll either fall on the bench onto the floor and you won't find it, and you go, what the heck was that? I just heard something fall. Or you'll put the things in the ultrasonic cleaner and it'll end up in the bottom of the cleaner, and if you're lucky you'll find it, and maybe you'll figure out where it goes, or maybe you won't. But I will say that it's been all too common occurrence for me to have that happen. So I'm going to remove the float assemblies. So these are, the float pins are held in by a little screw, which I've just dropped into the float ball. And again, on some carburetors, the jets can differ. So when you get a rack of 4 like this, some bikes have different jets for 1 and 4 than they have for 2 and 3. Because down, the pilots are down in here, right down in there. The other thing I will say is that while I'm keeping some of these components kind of separate and distinct for the moment, when it comes to cleaning and soaking the jets, they're probably all just going to go into the same container, because on this particular bike I know I'll double check it of course, but they're likely to all be the same. So this should be the fuel screw right here, right there. So we need to remove the fuel screw, and then along with that fuel screw there should be a spring, a washer, and an O-ring all stacked up inside here. And I'll show you what I used to get all that out. But before that, I'm going to double check how far down, how many turns these are seated. So I'm going to seat it and then count how many turns it takes to do that, so I can set the fuel screw properly after. So half, 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3. 3 turns. I'm just going to make a note of that. What that tells me, to be honest, is I would guess these could probably benefit from being run with larger pilots, bigger jetting. So I'll double check as part of this process what size jets I'm running here, because it's entirely possible that when they, previous owner, whoever that was many moons ago, put the aftermarket exhaust system on, that they didn't rejet it enough, bigger pilots, bigger mains, or whatever it takes. And oftentimes my understanding is if you don't jet it rich enough, you end up having the pilots wound out quite a bit more than stock. And in this case, I'd have to double check, but I'm pretty certain that that's the case here. All right, so here's what I use. It's just a dental pick. I have a whole whack of these things, different shapes and whatnot. This one's got tape on it for reasons I don't remember. And the end of this particular one, I'm getting focus here so you can see it. I bent it into this particular shape here, so it'll go into the hole where the pilot screw, the fuel screw goes, and I can kind of fish out the washer and the O-ring. So there's the washer, there's the O-ring, screw, spring, washer, O-ring. And again, I'm going to be replacing the O-rings in this set, because the kit I have comes with all new O-rings. So the next thing that I'm going to do here is remove the choke plungers from each of these. So there we go. So basically, I would say now these are disassembled as far as I really need to take them down. Some folks would kind of take you know, all of this stuff off, include like all these throttle linkages and whatnot. To be honest, it's not really necessary unless you have some reason to believe that there's so much corrosion inside where this shaft runs that it's hard to open, or whatever the case is. The screws that you see, in order to get these shafts out, you have to take the butterfly valve out here, the flap. That has to come out. And these two screws, they're actually staked over in the back. If you see this one here, this is the back side of it. You can see how they're staked over. So when you remove those things, you kind of either have to restake them or you have to Loctite them in somehow. And you also have to be very careful before you tighten these down, if you do take them out, that you kind of leave them loose enough, leave this plate loose enough, leave the screws loose enough that you can seat this thing down like that and get it to the point where it closes fully before you tighten them. The danger is if you tighten them prematurely before you've got this thing kind of fully seated back, then you're not going to get a proper seal on that carburetor body. But you want to make sure that you're not using carburetor cleaners anywhere near this, because there's a lot of I don't know if it's all carb cleaners, but a lot of them will just turn that rubber diaphragm into black goo and render it completely and totally useless. So, you know, chucking gobs of carburetor cleaner direct from the aerosol can into your carburetors when they're fully assembled, in my opinion, you're taking a big risk doing that. If you're gonna shoot carburetor cleaner around, make sure you've taken those diaphragms out first. So all I'm doing now, I'm just starting to get things organized so I can start to soak everything in the chemical cleaners. So I'm just removing the old float bowl gaskets. I'm removing the old O-rings off of the seats. And I would say that no matter what you remove, O-ring wise, although they may appear to be old and useless, don't throw anything away. And that goes for the little O-rings that go on the fuel screws, for the needles and seats. You never know when you're going to need a spare. Alright, so I've just double checked the jets. So it's 125 mains, 38 pilots. So I'm going to have to double check to see how that compares to what's supposed to be in there. But the thing is, they're all the same. So what I'm going to do next is I'm just using this little tray for nuts and bolts, and I'm going to just drop everything in here. I just need a reasonably contained place to soak these. Just tray up until everything is kind of submerged. Carburetor. And you can see the stuff coming out there. Similarly, I'll go into a number of all the other holes here, jets and whatnot. I just want to see it all coming out in the various places. And I'll also go in from this side. There's a number of spots to shoot stuff in, and just see where it comes out, where this diaphragm starts to seat. You can see it spraying. Can you see it spraying out of the carburetor body, coming out of here, out of the throat? So you can see if I squirt in here, it comes out of the main jet. All right. So you just want to make sure that you've got clear passageways. All right, so by and large, we are disassembled. Chemical cleaning is in progress. This stuff's going to kind of soak now for a while. I'm just going to kind of hit the outside of the carburetor bodies a little bit too, just to kind of aid in the the cleaning process, once it goes into the ultrasonic cleaner, everything will just come out that little bit better. However, I think the only thing left to do, and I forgot to take these out, is the drain. The drain screws are still in the bottom of the float bowls here, so I'll have to take those out. But aside from that, it's just kind of let this stuff soak. I'm going to let this stuff soak now for the rest of the day. So this is the kit that I purchased for the bike, and these are from a company called Litek, L-I-T-E-T-E-K, out of Thailand, and I've used these quite a number of times for quite a few different bikes over the years, and I've never ever been disappointed with the quality of these Viton silicone gaskets and O-rings they provide. So obviously these are the new float bowl gaskets. Some of them are obvious what they are. Others, I'll be honest, I end up having to go back onto the website and verify what they are. All right, so I've verified what everything is. These are the seats for the choke plunger, and okay, both of these are fuel O-rings. I actually only need 4 of these. So these are for the fuel T. And on the fuel T, which is this, that goes between carburetors 2 and 3, there's a total of 4 O-rings, 2 on each end of that. So that's what those are. So there's kind of extras there, I guess. And then these O-rings are the outside fuel crossover O-rings. And then there's basically these guys. These are the outside ones, right? And it's a slightly larger O-ring, 1 on each side. So they go between carburetors 1 and 2 and carburetors 3 and 4 for a total of 4 of those, and that's what those are. These are the vent tubes, and they also have O-rings on them. Now, having said that, maybe that's the extra 4 that I get here. They're probably the same size, but I can verify that, and they probably are. So, all right. So as I start to sort of take a closer look at the jets and the emulsion tubes and whatnot, this is where some of the carburetor mechanical cleaning tools come into play. These are basically for cleaning up jets and whatnot. Pick the right size and just make sure it'll pass through. One thing I don't do is I don't want to damage the insides of any jet, so I try to be very careful when I'm chasing any sort of holes, whether it's in the carburetor body or whether it's in the in jets or emulsion tubes or whatnot. So the whole idea is, like, and this one is just a guitar string, a high E, thinnest one, and yeah, just kind of putting these things into the various flute holes in these just to make sure they're all clear. Like that, kind of thread it all the way through, and then just clean it. So I'm going to do that with all of them just to make sure there's no blockages. So here are the chemicals that I use in the ultrasonic cleaner. This is industrial 297 Super Solve concentrate, and this is where I get it. And then also a splash of Pine Sol, and I like the lavender because it just smells good. Keeps me chilled out while I'm working in here with that smell. So yeah, got 15 liters of water in the ultrasonic cleaner. I'm going to add a splash of those chemicals. So we'll get those things lowered in. Then we'll get this unit plugged in, let that go for, I don't know, half an hour or so, and we'll fish them back out when they're done. There we go, they are back out of the ultrasonic cleaner, so I'll dry these off. I'll probably throw some compressed air through them, but by and large they are as clean as they're going to get. And that noise in the background is just me draining the ultrasonic cleaner. I just make it a practice to drain it every time I use it, because if you find anything in the bottom, you kind of want to know before you throw the next set of carbs in there, just in case something has come off, you know, gaskets or washers or who knows what. I'd rather find it now and know which set of carbs it's off of. Alright, so reassembly time, and the first thing I'm going to do is to install these new choke caps. So these things come off, they're kind of hard and brittle, and then these ones will go on. New one on, and then I'm just going to lightly snug these up with a 12mm wrench. Don't need to be cranking these things down too tight because then you're going to end up breaking the plastic. But okay, so next step is basically what I've done is I've replaced all of the washers and the O-rings on the fuel screws, all new ones there. And as I said before, I'm not going to throw away the old ones. They're going in the little zippy bag there, and I'll keep them as spares. But we'll drop these guys in, and then we're going to seat them, lightly seat them. You don't want to be cranking these things down super tight. You just want to lightly seat it and then back it out. In this case, 3 turns. Half, 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3. So I put the new O-rings on the fuel valve seats, and the retaining screws are back in there holding all of those on. So basically now what I'm doing is just working my way in reverse from the disassembly, and then obviously as I do that, I'm putting on any of the new O-rings and whatnot that have to go in there. And now I'm just going to basically take these jets and whatnot. They're all going to go back in. Again, at this point, it's just kind of the reverse of disassembly. If there's anything magical that I think of as I'm kind of going in reverse order here, I'll highlight that. But at this point, it's pretty straightforward. All right, so the valve assemblies are back in. The floats are back in with the retaining screw. And what I've done also is just kind of started to check the float height on all of these. And the book says that it's supposed to be 13 millimeters plus or minus 2 millimeters. And all of mine are right at around 13 millimeters. So they're all good to go. And yeah, so I'm happy with that. Yeah, so the tells me here that the main jet should be 135 for cylinders 1 and 4, and a 132 for cylinders 2 and 3. You can kind of see here. And then there's a 128 kind of in brackets here, for which is really I think the high altitude, according to the key at the bottom here, the high altitude ones. So I'm not sure how this ended up with 125s in it. The pilot is the right size at 38, but as I suspected, the 3 turns out is kind of a lot, right? So it's this is 1 5/8 plus or minus a quarter turn. And I'm at 3, so that just kind of confirms to me that this does likely need to get rejetted at some point. Okay, so just about to put the float bowls back on with the new gaskets, and just something to keep in mind with these float bowl gaskets: they are not symmetrical. At first glance, they may look symmetrical, but they're not. All right, one more word on float bowls before we call that done from this particular part of the carburetor perspective. If you're having trouble with these things sealing, even after putting a new gasket in them, it's not a bad idea to get a very flat sheet of metal. Oftentimes what I'll use is this deck on my drill press, or a piece of glass works well, and then stick a very fine piece of emery paper to it with some WD-40 squirted on, like something like an 800 grit will work okay. And then basically what you can do is you can turn this upside down and kind of give it this kind of motion, circular motion, just a little bit, and then you'll see where the float ball maybe has some high spots, and that can sometimes stop these things from seating properly, because what happens over time, as I've said before, is Johnny Armstrong, who put these on before you did and before I did, was practicing his arm and wrist strength when he put the screws in to the float bowl here. And of course that can over time distort the float bowls a little bit, so these ears on the corners can start to get bent down, and they will bottom out on here sometimes before the O-ring, before the gasket, the rubber actually seats and seals properly. So if you end up having that problem, it's not a bad idea to try that. Don't go crazy. You're not looking to take masses of metal off, but it'll show you pretty quick if you have a high spot. The only thing to watch for when you do that, if you do that, is on some carburetor bowls, they're not flat on the bottom. These ones are, so you could do it with these ones, but some of them have kind of raised lugs and portions on them. So of course you need to be careful that you're not shaving off the lugs or the raised portion. So you have to be kind of cognizant of that. But that's just kind of another top tip there in case you struggle with getting these things to seal. So the next thing that I'm doing here is just cleaning up the slides and the diaphragms a little bit. There's not a lot of magic involved with this, but you take them out, you might as well clean them, right? So all I'm using is a little bit of silicone spray. This stuff doesn't, at least so far in my experience, I've not had any issues with this stuff causing any sort of damage or problem to the diaphragm. You certainly don't want to be using carb cleaner on it, that's for certain, because carb cleaner will most definitely cause problems with the diaphragm, and it will melt the rubber. It's very, very easy to pinch the diaphragm when you put the cap on. And if you haven't got the diaphragm seated properly, or it's kinked a little bit, or it's not sitting in the groove, and you put the top cap on, that vacuum slide, so when you eventually these goes back on the bike and you start to rev the bike, and you have one of these slides that isn't moving and the rest are, chances are one of those diaphragms is pinched and there's not a good seal happening there. I know that because I've done it more than once. One thing you can do just to kind of double check a little bit before these things go back on the bike to make sure that you've got this stuff, like these top caps and the diaphragm seated properly, is just kind of see how these things react when you give them a flick. They should all kind of feel the same. So they feel fine, I think. All right, so these are the fuel transfer tubes. These ones go between carburetors 1 and 2 and carburetors 3 and 4. Put the new O-rings on, a very, very light coat of rubber grease just to help them slide in. You don't want to use regular grease because you don't want the regular grease might deteriorate the seal, but so you can use rubber grease on here only. And then basically what I like to do is I like to assemble carbs 1 and 2 first, then carbs 3 and 4, and then I'll put the 2 sets together and join 2 and 3. So transfer tubes go in, and then also the sink spring has to go in here, and there's another spring that kind of fits in here as well that has to kind of go in. So transfer tubes there. Okay, now the spring goes in between carburetors 1 and 2. Throttle linkage there. And then the sink spring has to sit under here. Now the trick is to get it to go in without firing it across the shop. Like that. That wasn't too bad. All right, new O-rings going on. There. And this probably goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. You cannot get away with taking these carburetors apart and not resyncing the carbs later. Just can't. You have to. You got to resync the carburetors. That's the bottom line. Even if you don't monkey with the screws, just sometimes even just pulling the carbs off the bike can mess things up. So you do have to sync the carbs every time you take them apart. And the other thing that will mess up the syncing of the carburetors is when you adjust the valves, because basically as you change the valve clearances, you're effectively changing the amount of vacuum that's getting pulled. So yeah, you gotta do all of that. All right, so the center fuel tube is back in. Just kind of, if you're reusing the existing hosing, just make sure you've got it facing in the right direction. And I've just put the choke slide bar back on, and the main clamping bolt is back in. I do put a little bit of never seize on these things, just a dab, just because, you know, why not? You've got it apart. When you put it back together, nice to avoid the problems with galvanic corrosion down the road, in case it's me or the next person that ends up having to take these apart. So yeah, just good practice, I think, to do that. And last but not least is flipping this thing around and putting the main racking bar back on. And then once that's on, we'll put them back in the little wash tub here. I will hook them up to a fuel supply, and they can sit on a fuel supply for a day, just making sure that they're not going to leak. Because at this point, you kind of want to make sure that, you know, needle and seats are okay, all the new O-rings are doing their job, the new gaskets on the float balls, nothing's leaking anywhere. If you're going to get a leak, if I'm going to get a leak, I want to know now, not when it goes back on the bike, right? So best to check all that kind of stuff right after you get them built. All right, so I've got the carbs in the washing up bowl with a piece of shop towel in there. Shop towel just helps to identify if they're going to leak. It shows up pretty quick. And I've got them attached to the remote fuel bottle. There's put that much fuel in here, which would be plenty to test. So turn that on, and then we'll see if there's any immediate leaking as these things fill up. And then if there's nothing immediate, as I said before, I'm going to leave this for the rest of the day, and we'll see how it goes. So far so good. Everything looks dry. There's no staining on the shop towel or anything, so I think we're okay for now. So thanks for watching. Appreciate everybody coming back to check out this video. I'm not sure how many carburetor rebuild videos people can actually watch, but it's part of the process. I can only show you what I'm doing at any given point in time. But stay tuned. Next week, I'm hoping I get to the valve clearance adjustments and the reshimming of the valves. I got everything that I was waiting for in the mail. So we'll get to that. Stay tuned for that. Thanks a lot. Bye.